years and counting. Powered by cable.
Well, up next, Wisconsin Republican Senator Ron Johnson and former CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield reflect on how public health was administered during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Redfield, who was director during the pandemic, criticized former National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Director Dr. Anthony Fauci and others working in the public health system at the time for not allowing more diversity of thought. Hosted by the Heritage Foundation, this is About an Hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Heritage President Dr. Kevin Roberts.
Thanks. Welcome. It's great to have all of you here. We're in the middle of taking this country back. That deserves applause, don't you think? Not because I said it, but because it's happening. I remember many years ago, I was an academic. In fact, I was leading a K through 12 school I had founded, and I read a book by someone who's become a really close friend, a great thinker, and along the lines of friendship, someone you can disagree with, which I still do occasionally, Rod Dreher, now in the great nation of Hungary most of the time. But one of his first books was called Crunchy Cons. And I read it in 2 or 3 days. I mean, I just devoured it because I thought that as a lifelong movement conservative, that you couldn't also do what my family was doing, which was raising chickens. Most people don't know that the president of the Heritage Foundation is a now retired chicken farmer, forced into retirement by my wife, who said we ought not have a few hundred chickens while running a school, and trying to eat organic things and be wary of things like seed oils. And then we got busy with professional things, and I encountered a lot of people in the last few years, including colleagues here, Roger Severino, Jay Richards, and many others, friends adjacent to Heritage, like Dr. Tammy Huizinga, and a new friend and colleague at Heritage, Bob Redfield, who are all focused on this. And so all of that to lead up to what we're doing today, which is making a really important announcement. But all of this culminated in a speech that Robert Kennedy Jr. made on August 23rd. And to think about this lifelong conservative ever saying that he would stand at Heritage and be in a political coalition with Mr. Kennedy is something I never thought I would say. And I say that with really no sarcasm, but with real seriousness and tremendous respect for Mr. Kennedy. And I know that not everyone attending this, part of this effort, watching this, necessarily sees it as I do as a matter of faith. But I can't help but think, as we sit here today in the waning days of Advent, almost to celebrate our Savior's birth, that God's hand is involved. For the sake of our health, for the sake of our movement, for the sake of our leaders, Mr. Kennedy, of course, among them, President-elect Trump, Vice President-elect Vance, Senator Johnson, all of these great men and women, regardless of what the political labels they use, it just tells me that if, in fact, as I started my comments with, we're in the process of taking back this country, this isn't merely about politics and policy. It is really about our health and, dare I say, our souls. Keep in mind that RFK didn't just make an endorsement of the Trump-Vance ticket. He spoke passionately about the dangerous influence of big government, big pharma, the big food, the big media cartel, something, to go back to my reference to Rod Dreher's great book, Crunchy Cons, he talks about. And it's that collusion that's been harming our health and fueling an epidemic of chronic diseases, particularly among children. Millions of Americans from across the political spectrum care deeply about this issue. And frankly, they don't care which political party wants to take credit, which wants to lead the coalition. In fact, to the extent that that doesn't happen, it's even better because it's more authentic. And to his credit, RFK has been sounding the alarm for years about that dangerous nexus of government agencies, nonprofits, and corporations that have made Americans sicker and fatter. His speech endorsing Mr. Trump shed light on this growing problem. And the fact that it happened in about the time the presidential campaign was going into its home stretch, I think gave it an import that ironically transcended politics, although clearly we think it had a positive impact on the Trump-Vance ticket. And so while there have long been concerned Americans from across the political spectrum, it wasn't until the COVID crisis of 2020 that the public saw the full extent of this unholy alliance. As you know, the threat we face today doesn't fit neatly into the public versus private framework of the past. This is, very plainly, a collusion among government, corporations, the media, and nonprofits, most of them in this town, and groups that should remain separate and independent. And I'm here to tell you, not just on behalf of Heritage, on behalf of all of our friends, taking our country back means we're going to break the back of that collusion here in this city. And the reason that I can be so bold in saying that is not because of any hubris on behalf of Heritage, certainly not any hubris that any of our panelists have. They're all very meek and great patriots. It's that the American people want this to happen. And the time has come as we refound this country and its institutions that we, of course, place in our sights, politically speaking, that collusion. But thinking about the lessons learned in COVID, in 2020, millions of Americans saw how public health agencies seem more concerned with nudging entire populations rather than treating individual patients. As the lockdowns dragged on, many feared the public health bureaucracy had itself become a grave threat to medical freedom. Things only grew more concerning as pharmaceutical companies received expedited approvals for their Myrna vaccines, which were soon mandated nationwide, creating an artificial market for those drugs. Meanwhile, the drug companies were shielded from liability, while those skeptical of the vaccine were censored and those harmed by the vaccine were silenced. I lived this firsthand when I was leading the Texas Public Policy Foundation, telling all of them, well, in a polite company, to go pound sand. Big Pharma reaped profits from these policies without facing the downside risks from long-term harm to people who received the shots. But the silver lining, and at Heritage we always look for the silver lining, and now we're living the first phases of that, is that while those experiences were grim, they also woke up at least half of the American people to the deeper threats to our personal liberties. The American people are now primed and open to a related truth. The massive spike in many chronic diseases of civilization also involves big government, big food, big pharma, and the legacy media that rely on ad dollars and medical lobbying outfits, such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, that masquerade as science crusaders. And so what we're doing today is trusting the science. And the science is clear. If, in fact, we want Americans to be healthier, if we want a greater emphasis on medical freedom, if we want physicians to be able to practice, if, in fact, we want this society to flourish, not just because elections are going well and elected officials have the courage to say what is right and true and the American people are behind them, we might also be interested in this body politic being the healthiest it's ever been. And so what we're commencing today in great alliance with friends allied with Heritage and this wonderful realigned coalition is an effort that at Heritage we call the Restoring American Wellness. I was getting caught up in some other acronyms. Restoring American Wellness is our attempt here at Heritage to add some substance to this effort. And the thing that I want to lead you with before introducing my colleague who will get us going in the first panel is that if we miss this opportunity to restore American wellness, it isn't just a missed political opportunity. It isn't just a missed opportunity to add yet another important chapter to this realignment. It's a missed opportunity to truly restore the health, the medical health, the physical health, the mental health of the American populace, particularly our children. And that, of course, is the greatest moral obligation that all of us, whether elected policymakers or for us at Heritage, non-elected policymakers have. It is a true honor for us at Heritage to welcome those of you who are here today in spite of your busy schedules, who are leaders in this effort. And although you have to account for the fact that at Heritage we are naturally optimistic, we know that we're winning, and we know that we're going to win on this issue because of your courage and leadership. So please join me in welcoming someone who's a great friend and colleague who is helping to spearhead this effort, not just inside Heritage, but of course across the movement in the country, our Vice President of Domestic Policy, Roger Severino.
So, I have a confession to make. I am a fugitive at law. A few years ago, I was standing with my family, huddled in front of a church in an act of civil disobedience, because it was illegal at the time for more than 10 people to be gathered outdoors together. My family, we have 6 kids, that was 8 of us. And it was at least one family, or several families, 8 feet apart, and we were in violation of the law. But I thought to my family, we had to communicate what is truly important in life. Our obligations to God first, state second. So how did we get to this crazy situation where a family outdoors, spaced away from everybody else, were deemed lawbreakers, enemies of public health, to be scorned, to be hunted down? Well, this panel will help address some of these questions and more. We lost our way during COVID, and we lost our way in more ways than one, and RFK Jr. has brought to light these issues of the corruption between the biosecurity state, big pharma, big agriculture. The American people also went along with it. To discuss these issues and what can be done, I have 3 amazing panelists. First, the Honorable Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. He was elected, yes. He was elected to the Senate in 2010 after running a successful manufacturing business in Oshkosh, Wisconsin for 30 years. He currently serves as a ranking member of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations and is also a member of the Budget and Finance Committees. He was elected to his 3rd term in 2022 and resides in Oshkosh with his wife, Jane, and they have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Our second panelist is Dr. Martin Kulldorff. He's an epidemiologist, a biostatistician, and a founding fellow at Hillsdale College Academy for Science and Freedom. He's been a professor of medicine at Harvard University for 13 years. And in October of 2020, he co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, advocating for a pandemic strategy focused on protecting the vulnerable instead of lockdowns. Our third panelist is Dr. Robert Redfield. He's a virologist who served as the director of the CDC from 2018 to 2021 after being appointed by President Donald Trump. He's a senior visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and is married to Joyce Hoke, who he met while delivering babies as a med student, and she was a nursing assistant. They have 6 children and 9 grandchildren. Before I invite you up, my first question will be teed off of a video, which we shall play now.
I can't do it anymore, Marcus. I can't do it anymore. I'm gonna die. I'm too young to die.
This is our life now. This is our life now, okay? We're gonna go on. It's gonna be...
I can't go on, Marcus. I can't do this. I'm gonna die.
Why are you shaking my hand?
I gotta run. I can't go to jail. I can't go to jail, Marcus. I can't.
Come back. Come back.
Oh God, they're coming. They're coming.
Shut up. Shut up. Shut up.
Oh no!
Hey, there we go! There we go! With your hand on your head, lay flat on the ground, not to tip the foot.
Oh, hey, Ted.
Oh, hey, Marcus, how are you?
Good. We out for a little run?
Yeah, just did 7. I might do another 7, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't want to hold you up. Hey, let's grab dinner sometime.
I would love that.
All right.
You, me,
Good
Karen.
seeing you. Absolutely. I mean...
911, what's your emergency?
Hi, yeah. I got a couple handshakers right in front of me.
Okay, sir, are they still in the vicinity?
Yeah, I'm staring at them right now.
Run.
Please welcome our panelists. So, Senator Johnson, we will start with you. You sit on Senate Finance. You've also been on a subcommittee on investigations. You've cared a lot about the corruption in our public health agencies. In 2025, what will you be investigating on these sorts of issues?
Well, it's going to, I've said repeatedly, I'll be like a mosquito in a nudist colony. It's a target-rich environment. So I've got to set my priorities, and a lot will depend on what documents we actually get. I think a lot of mistakes are made when people are investigating, they're interviewing people, or they're holding hearings. You don't have the documentary evidence to be able to ask the pointed questions too. But I've written during COVID over 60 oversight letters to the federal agencies, including the Department of Defense. Pretty well just gotten the middle finger. We haven't gotten those documents. I think there's a commitment. I just had Bobby Kennedy in my office, but also Kash Patel and others. They want to look forward. They want to solve the problems. They need to, big mess in their hands. They want to, make America healthy again. I think what they're going to do is provide the transparency and access to documents to Congress to do the oversight. And, we'll highlight the problems to correct them, hold people accountable. So, again, there are so many areas that I want to delve into. When it comes to COVID, one of the reasons I ran for re-election, one of the primary reasons is nobody was acknowledging the vaccine injured. There's an excellent book by Brianne Dressen. She's one of the first individuals I highlighted in a panel in Milwaukee. Horribly vaccine injured from the AstraZeneca trial. These individuals cannot even have their injuries acknowledged, much less addressed and treatment being given to them. So I want to uncover exactly what federal agencies knew, when they knew it. One of my most recent oversight letters was really based on the Pfizer papers. They've got some FOIA documents that are heavily redacted. But we know that the agencies knew early in 2021 that these shots caused myocarditis. Israeli officials were asking them the questions. They were going to issue a warning on the Health Alert Network. That didn't happen. Instead, they wrote a 17-page talking points memo, all redacted. So what I'll first subpoena, and I'll probably have to subpoena these records, I want the last 50 pages of Fauci's emails, which we have not received unredacted yet. There's got to be a reason for that. I want those 17 pages of talking points. So again, we're going to be very targeted in our efforts to get to the truth, reveal to the American public what our federal health officials knew and what they covered up, and that'll be the first step in accountability.
Okay. Dr. Koldorf, so the video, it was actually Kevin James, the actor comedian, who did that during COVID and got a lot of criticism for it. You received a tremendous amount of criticism for the Great Barrington Declaration. Speak a little bit about what the Declaration said and your views on what has happened with evidence-based science in the last few years.
So very early in the pandemic from Wuhan, it was very clear that while anybody can get infected, there's more than 1,000-fold difference in risk or mortality from COVID. So from that perspective, it's obvious based on the principles of public health that you protect those who are at highest risk, which were the older people. And you let children go to school, that's very important, schools, and you let young adults live normal lives. So there was never any evidence for doing these lockdowns or school closures, etc. So in the Great Barrington Declaration, we argued that there is actually no scientific consensus for lockdowns. And before that, they had basically tried to anybody who objected, like Scott Atlas, for example. He was only one person, or he was in the wrong specialty. But because there were three of us who were all infectious disease immunologists from Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford, they couldn't ignore us. So I think we sort of managed to burst the bubble where people thought there was consensus for these unscientific lockdowns when there wasn't. So basically, during the pandemic, we threw away evidence-based medicine and the basic principles of public health just out the window. And I think there's now a lack of trust in the scientific community and in public health for good reason. There should be a lack of trust. But what we need to do is to get back to evidence-based medicine and the basic principles of public health.
Dr. Redfield, Dr. Kohler mentioned the lack of trust in our public health agencies. What do you think led to the lack of trust, and how can it be restored?
Well, I think that's the greatest harm that was done, was the loss of public trust in our agencies. Obviously, CDC, which I ran, but I'd say the same is true for NIH and the FDA. And I think the basis for it really was a lack of honesty of some of our public health leaders. You know, I was extremely disappointed that there was not an openness to diversity of thought. Science, you would argue, would have diversity of thought and would debate situations. For example, when the Great Barrington Declaration came out, which it turns out, if you look at it objectively, was actually right on from a public policy point of view. But rather than debate it, you had public health leaders telling the world that these were fringe individuals that were, you know, just off the wall. And I think that's what's really sad. There were some individuals, and, you know, my own view is when you're in public life, you probably shouldn't be able to be in that position for more than a decade. You ought to move on, otherwise you may take yourself too seriously. And I do think there was a lack of sort of openness that that maybe you didn't have all the answers. You know, I do think that we had certain people that dominated the public opinion. I know when it came to lockdowns, I was not, I didn't get to participate in that discussion with the president, the vice president, and Tony Fauci and Debbie Birx. Because I was never an advocate of closing the schools. I was never an advocate of the lockdowns. I didn't think it was sound public health policy. I was, even though I didn't call it the Great Barrier Declaration, I was one that we needed to protect the vulnerable. So we have lost public trust. There's no doubt about it. And it really harms public health in a big way. We've lost, I think, trust in science. You know, I mean, I think Tony made a big mistake when he said, when you criticize me, you criticize science. That, you know, that's sort of, no, that's not what we're saying. We need to have honest, open discussions and debates. That's what science is about. And we didn't have it. I agree with my colleague here. We lost the ability to really have open, honest discussions. And we really have to try to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Senator Johnson, should Fauci appear before your committee again? What are the big unanswered questions that still need to be dealt with? And how do we build from that and pivoting towards reform? What reform ideas do you think need to be investigated?
Well, the number one thing we need to do is restore confidence and integrity to science and to scientific research. It's been corrupted. You know, Eisenhower warned us about this in his farewell address. He talked about the military-industrial complex, but right behind that, he warned us about public funding of research. It would create a scientific and technological elite, Fauci, Collins, that tried to crush. I mean, they have emails. We need to destroy the individuals that wrote the Barrington Declaration. So he was right, but I would go further. What public funding of science has done, particularly in the hands of one person over 4 decades, it's corrupted it. When you pay for research, you get the result you want. Whether it's climate change, obviously the big pharma, they're the ones that run the placebo trials. They're expensive. They're the only ones who can afford it. I mean, to understand the corruption, understand that it was the FDA that went to court to block the release of the Pfizer trial data for 75 years. I mean, Pfizer would have gone to court, I'm sure, to block it as well, but they didn't have to because the corrupt FDA did it for them. That should be completely transparent. You know, a quick little story about Francis Collins. You know, I was concerned. You know, one of the reasons they lost trust is they sabotaged early treatment. Go home, be afraid, hope you don't get so sick so that our hospital protocols don't kill you. Okay, so they sabotage early treatment. I asked Francis Collins, what are you doing in terms of investigating use of generic drugs? So, oh, Senator, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on it. Okay, well, send me the results. I mean, show me how you're spending hundreds of millions. Never showed it to me. Fast forward to about April of 2021 when the harms of the vaccine were obvious on VAERS, a couple thousand deaths, 46% occurring on the day of vaccination or within 1 or 2 days. I'm in a meeting with Francis Collins with a bunch of other my colleagues. They're patting themselves on the back because they finally got the test right to overestimate how many people had COVID. But I asked him, well, I'm the skunk in the room. I said, Dr. Collins, are you watching VAERS? Again, a few thousand deaths, 46% occurring on the day of vaccination within 1 or 2 days. I said, well, Senator, we've only attributed 6 deaths with the J&J vaccine. Then he just very, very callously said, Senator, people die. That was his response to the safety signals screaming at them from the VAERS system. But somebody like me who was made aware that there may be problems with the mRNA platform, I'm vilified, I'm censored, I'm going on radio stations, and the radio talk show hosts, they would be deplatformed on Facebook and other social media. So again, it was a complete collapse of integrity within our federal health agencies because they have been captured by big pharma. And that's not just our federal health agencies, but go across the board. And I think, Callie Means would be talking about this. Across the board, you've got government. Government has power. Power corrupts. The big business that is regulated by government agencies figure out how to survive, and then even beyond that, figure out how they can use those agencies to their benefit, detriment of their customers, and the result of the American public. So that's in a nutshell what's going on. That's what needs to be fixed. That's what needs to be uncorrupted.
Dr. Koldorf, tell me about the corruption in academia, research institutions. Tell us a bit about the money flows. Is there true academic freedom when we're talking about medical research in today's day and age, given that the federal government has such an outsized funding role in it?
Well, if we look at the pandemic, the biggest chunk of infectious disease research money was controlled by Dr. Fauci. So he took a very active role about the pandemic policy. And then, of course, academics will be very hard-pressed to contradict him because their livelihood and their family's livelihood is dependent on Fauci. But it was very strange during the pandemic because NIH is a research organization. Their role is not policy or public health policy. They should have focused on doing the studies to find out, for example, about genetic drugs, if they can help against COVID. Just try one after the other, doing those studies. That was their role. The role of public health policy is CDC at the federal level and then the state health department. But somehow it was Fauci who sort of took over that public health policy, which doesn't make any sense. He should have focused on doing the studies that was needed to understand the pandemic better, which he sort of didn't do, and instead he sort of took over the policy, and I think that was wrong.
And Fauci hid behind, this is just guidance, knowing full well that every state in the nation, except for Florida and a few others, we're going to take that guidance and use the force of law. Dr. Redfield, you were there when some of those decisions were being discussed. Was it known that all the CDC guidance would be actually implemented by force of law at the time?
No, I think, traditionally, and I know my own perspective on it as the director was, our guidance was just that. It was guidance. Unfortunately, that's not how it got operationalized. For example, I was not an advocate of closing schools. I felt that the public health interest of K through 12 was much better served by them staying in face-to-face learning than from them to be out of face-to-face learning. But very rapidly, because of public pressure in different states, different governors decided that we were going to close down schools. The teachers union obviously closed down schools. I'm proud. One of the awards, I don't get very many awards, but one of the awards I did get, and I'm very proud of it, was the Archdiocese of Baltimore, because I worked with the Archbishop to keep the Catholic schools open in Baltimore, and they did, and they had the highest scores they've ever had in their standardized testing, whereas the Baltimore City schools had some of the lowest they've ever had. So there was not an open, there was never an intent that these would be laws. These were guidance. I was very upset about the way some of the perspectives were on physicians that wanted to use off-label drugs to treat COVID, whether it was ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. I know as the CDC director, I decided to publish all the information we had about the use of hydroxychloroquine in humans. I know CDC was very angry at me, said I shouldn't publish that in the MMWR because they say it sounds like you're endorsing it for treatment. I said, no, I'm not endorsing it, but physicians may choose to use this, and I want them to have all the knowledge that we have. But there was this attitude that if you were to share that information, it was somehow an endorsement. We saw the opposite with vaccines, and I couldn't agree with the Senator more how critical it is that we give credibility to vaccine injury. I practice now 2 days a week, and a significant amount, and it's mostly all long COVID, but a number of my patients never had COVID, but they had the mRNA vaccine, and they are really, really, really seriously injured. Well, there was a big attitude about vaccines where I don't think there was honest information. And I remember one story that Tony had told people that once we got to 30% immunity, we'd have herd immunity and the pandemic would be over. And then later he told people that it was 50%. And then not much later, maybe a month or two later, he said 70%. And I remember a reporter that was kind of with it said, Dr. Fauci, what scientific data came in between the last time when you said it was 50% and now that you said it's 70% that made you change your mind? And I kid you not, it's a matter of record. Tony said, there is no new data, but when I told you 50%, I just didn't think you were ready to hear 70%. And this is where I come back. Public health leaders just have to tell the American public the truth. Just tell them the truth and let them make the judge. Don't try to package the information in a way that they will decide what you want them to decide. And that's what happened here. There was a proactive decision that anything that suggested that vaccines didn't work would somehow maybe push people not to get vaccinated. So therefore, we were going to oversell the vaccines. The vaccines clearly were oversold. They should have never been mandated. People should have never lost their jobs or livelihood. The senator knows, I feel that we really, I think the intent in making no liability for vaccines when they passed those laws was well intended, but it doesn't work. These companies have to be able to be held liable for their products like any other company. Hopefully Congress will change that so that these companies that make these vaccines that do have vaccine injury, people can get compensated for the injury they suffered, particularly in a situation which was so inappropriate where they were mandated to get this vaccine, even if their instincts were not to get the vaccine.
Let me quick hop in here because it was more sinister than that. The fact that they sabotaged early treatment. I mean, truthfully, I was working with Novartis. They were all excited about trials on hydroxychloroquine. That just ended. And my conversations is just radio silence after the end of April. It's like somebody turned a switch going, we're not looking at early treatment. Then they went and sabotaged, ivermectin. You're not a horse. I mean, why did they do it? Well, if you had an effective therapy, you can't get an emergency use authorization on a vaccine. Okay? Again, this was corrupt. This was sinister, and hundreds of thousands of people, doctors have said this, I'm not a doctor, probably lost their lives lacking early treatment. So people need to understand that. That's what we need to hold people accountable to. And we have to lay out that reality because it's an awful reality.
So could you just repeat that? That is such an important point. the fact that ivermectin was a possible available alternative treatment could have cost who money, and in the billions, correct?
Well, yeah, Pfizer, Moderna. And again, I remember Pierre Corey, we had him testify about corticosteroids the end of May, when I had John Ioannidis talk about this. It's not SARS, this isn't Ebola, this is going to be like a bad flu season, trying to calm people down. We had Pierre Corey come and talk about corticosteroids. Of course, he was vilified for that until about 8 weeks later. There's a study on dexamethasone, underdosed, by the way, is how it was used. But all of a sudden, that became a standard of care. He came in with ivermectin. He had a big manuscript. Thought the pandemic's over. This is testifying in December, before the emergency use authorization. Didn't realize how they were going to crush ivermectin and never really saw the light of day in terms of use. But again, paved the way for the emergency use authorization for the vaccines. And then it was full speed ahead. Don't take a look at any problems it might cause. I mean, this is what we've committed to. This is what we're starting to mandate. And the result, and by the way, read Breanne Dressen's book, Worth a Shot. You'll get a real sense of how outrageous our public response has been to the vaccine injured. It's unconscionable what we've done, what we haven't done.
Dr. Koldorf, let's talk a bit about the effect on children. I fear there's a whole cohort of children that will be delayed developmentally, economically, educationally, because of the lockdowns and the treatments. What was the state of the evidence for isolating, first, just lockdowns generally, as a solution to this type of outbreak, and on children in particular, when the lockdowns were imposed on kids too?
There were very early evidence from Iceland that children do not spread COVID very efficiently. So there will be adults giving it to children, but not the other way around. Famously, Sweden did not close the schools in the spring of 2020. They kept all the schools and daycare open for ages 1 to 15. So when New England Journal of Medicine in July wrote an article about school closures, you would expect them to sort of discuss what happened in Sweden. But they didn't. They ignored Sweden. That's like doing a drug trial and ignore the placebo group. So because in early summer, I think it was July 7th, the Swedish Public Health Authority, they published what happened to the 1.8 million Swedish children in ages 1 to 15. And the number who died from COVID was exactly 0. There were a few hospitalizations, but exactly 0 deaths. And they looked at the teachers, and they were no higher risk than other professions. So it was very obvious from the evidence in the early summer that it was safe to keep schools open during the pandemic. So there was absolutely no reason to keep them closed anymore. And I'm a native of Sweden, so I could read all the Swedish stuff, but they published it in English. So I tried to spread it, but on Twitter, for example, but I was trans-blacklisted because I was trying to get this report out on Twitter. I tried to publish things in the U.S. media, but that wasn't very successful. Even, I guess I was only a professor at Harvard, that's not very prestigious. So, but finally in August, I actually managed to get CNN to publish a piece on the Swedish experience with the school closures. But not the CNN you think. It was in CNN Espanol, because I can write Spanish. So CNN English were not interested in this thing. So the evidence was there that it was perfectly safe to keep the schools open. We obviously know that education is very important for children, because otherwise we wouldn't have schools. So I think it is very tragic that we let down our children during the pandemic. And all children were affected, but obviously the poor children, working class children the most, because I think Gavin Newsom's, his kids went to private school, so they never lost any school. And so if you were wealthy, you could have hire tutors and stuff like that, and I'm very happy for those children. But that was not an option for regular working class children.
Let's broaden the conversation a bit. So Dr. Redfield, what do you think are the greatest public health threats on the horizon or present?
Well, in light of the discussion that we've had so far, just to highlight it, I think it's so important to embrace diversity of thought, which I think we've lost, okay? So I think I just want to come back to that because of a lot of the mistakes that were made during the COVID pandemic were driven by the lack of diversity of thought. You know, some of us that had a different point of view, I know, I was rapidly defined by my colleagues at NIH as a conspirator because I'm of the view that this virus is a virologist, where it's one of the most infectious viruses that we have for human transmission. Normally when a virus goes from an animal to human, it takes a long time for it to learn how to be efficient in its transmission. So SARS and MERS really still to this day haven't learned how to be efficiently transmitted. This virus was immediately one of the most infectious viruses. So as a virologist, I concluded that this is a virus that came from the laboratory, that it was educated how to infect humans. I was immediately ostracized, and had death threats, etc., by the scientific community. I even have letters from some of my colleagues that used to give me an award that said the best thing I could do for the country would be just to take my own life because I should keep my mouth shut about my views about this coming from a laboratory. So there was no openness to thought. Now, when you ask me what are the biggest threats in public health right now, my own view is what led us to this COVID pandemic was not nature. It was gain-of-function research that was done that intentionally tried to teach these pathogens how to be more pathogenic for human. There's a semantical argument that the senator I know knows, and our friend, colleague Rand Paul knows well. Some people, Tony, will argue that he didn't do gain-of-function research because the National Academy of Science defines gain-of-function research is if you have to start with a pathogen that's already pathogenic for humans and make it more pathogenic for humans to be gain-of-function research. If you start with a pathogen that's not pathogenic for humans, and you teach, like COVID, and you teach it how to be highly pathogenic by humans, by definition, they say that's not gain-of-function. Well, that's ludicrous. It's gain-of-function. So I do think this gain-of-function research and the risk that we have for what I call scientific arrogance of creating these pathogens, and I'm very concerned about bird flu. Not from nature, even though it's trying hard to learn how to infect humans. It's now in over 28 mammals in the United States. We obviously went into dairy cows, and now it's gone into pigs, which as a virologist makes me nervous because the flu virus, when it replicates, has 6 different pieces to replicate, and if you get 2 flu viruses in the same animal, they can recombine. And the one that usually recombines to give us human flu viruses is usually the pig. And so we went from dairy cattle now into pigs. I'm worried that we can get some combinations. And if we do get a flu virus that knows a bird flu virus that knows how to go human to human efficiently, we're going to have a catastrophic pandemic. There's no doubt about it. That said, I don't think that that's the greatest threat. I think the greatest threat is the gain-of-function research. And I was very disappointed that NIH just awarded in the senator's state, maybe him and Rand Paul will look at it, into Wisconsin. They just awarded the University of Wisconsin money to help take bird flu and teach it how to infect humans. All right? I just think that's really stupid, okay? These are the same scientists that were involved in teaching COVID how to infect humans. So I think that's the greatest threat to me. But I think before that, at the higher level threat is this lack of openness to diversity of opinion. Science is based on diversity of opinion. And my friend, colleague here from Harvard is right. There was absolutely no tolerance for diversity of opinion. We both got ostracized in different ways because of our scientific thoughts.
Senator Johnson, do you think with the RFK Jr. phenomenon that this presents a unique opportunity for legislation to restore American health, the Make America Healthy Again movement? You had met with RFK Jr., correct? And we're big fans at the Heritage Foundation. Again, unusual for Heritage to be endorsing a Kennedy, but he has opened up a right-left coalition that I think is unique at this moment. Chronic disease is everywhere. What do you see Congress's role in this particular moment?
It's primarily to expose the truth. Again, I come from the private sector, manufacturing. You know, there's a process for solving a problem. It starts with admitting you have one. Then the most important part is properly defining it. Once you're doing that, now you look for root causes. I mean, we start talking about legislation, you're already talking about the solution, and that's what's wrong with Washington, D.C. Everybody's got a solution, totally misguided because they didn't go through the steps. So let me just, from my standpoint, here are the root causes to our public health problem, because we have one. I mean, we all recognize it. First of all, this kind of addressed some things Dr. Redfield talked about. Doctors are now at the bottom of the treatment pyramid. They should be at the top, but they're being crushed by the agencies. I mean, guidance, absolutely those guidances are going to be taken by. The other problem is our third-party payer system. Okay, we have taken the benefits of free market competition, consumerism, out of health care. I'm on Senate Finance. We hold all these hearings on Medicare, and every witness says we have to restore competition to health care. And yet nobody proposes a solution to that, and there won't be as long as government pays for about half, insurance companies pay for about the other half. You know, again, consumers are completely taken out of the equation. I think we spend something about 10 cents of every healthcare dollar coming from the consumer, and it's on minor stuff. So we need to put doctors again at the top of the treatment pyramid. They are responsible to patients. Again, this shift from independent doctors to now hired hands of these major hospital associations being funded by the third-party payer system, it's just a problem. Again, this has evolved over decades, and so you first have to start, how did we transition from independent doctors and consumerism to the model we have now? Because the model we have now is not working. We have to acknowledge that fact. We have to admit that problem, but you have to go all the way back and follow the history. And how can we, restore that type of consumerism and the primacy of doctors into the system that we don't have right now? So again, I'm not interested in legislation right now. I'm about educating the public. How do we get to the state? Talk about changes in sanitation, which has really solved most of our disease problems. Changes in agriculture. What do we need to be concerned about? The soils, the microbiome, the depletion of nutrients, that type of thing. That's to make America healthy. What has changed in food processing? What has changed in medicine? What has changed in pharmaceuticals? Again, you got to go through that historical timeline to understand, to properly define the problem before you ever start designing legislation, because trust me, the legislation will be misguided otherwise. I mean, we do it all the time. That's why we spend $7 trillion and we create or exacerbate more problems than we ever solve in the federal government. I'm not a fan of the federal government, if that doesn't come across.
Neither are we. So I think health savings accounts are one option to empower the patients.
Absolutely. And you need that because, unfortunately, we've got the American public to just assume somebody else is going to pay for my health care. They don't understand the destructive nature of that assumption. That has taken them out of the loop. They're not sovereign. They're not making decisions. Somebody else is making that decisions for them. So until they are willing to accept that responsibility, and about the only way you can do that is starting with health savings accounts where somebody else is putting the money in there that they're going to spend, but then allow them to use that health savings account for their retirement, so they're going to spend it wisely. And then again, this is what drove me nuts about Obamacare. It actually moved us in the right direction in terms of high deductible insurance. And I know people hate it, but that's what insurance ought to be for catastrophic events, major illness, an accident, that kind of stuff. Otherwise, consumers ought to be paying for the vast majority of the health care we get. We'd be far wiser. And we would demand, real evidence. I mean, again, I don't think evidence-based medicine works because science has been corrupt. What's the evidence with corrupt science? Again, I'll shut up. We got, like I said, I've got a lot to reveal, a lot to expose in this next Congress.
Well, Senator Johnson, you should never shut up. We need your voice.
Well, my colleagues may not.
Question for the scientists. So we spoke a bit about the corruption of the public health agencies. We have the capture, where you have the revolving door that's well known. If you go into our regulatory bodies, FDA in particular, and you play ball, the tacit understanding, at the very least, is that there will be a nice, cushy job for you in Big Pharma waiting for you, and vice versa. Have you seen this sort of conflict of interest? Any examples that come to mind, and what can be done about this?
Well, I think there's a revolving door with FDA and pharma, both at the highest level, like Scott Gottlieb, as well as at the bid level. And I think I'm one of the few people who work on drug and vaccine safety who's never taken any money from the pharmaceutical industry, and I think I've done that by principle because I want no conflict of interest and no perceived conflict of interest. On another question that you asked before to Dr. Redfield, or what are the biggest public health issues, there are very, very many, and one is actually has to do with family, because I think the family is the foundation of American society, but it's breaking down and has been breaking down, and especially in poorer communities. And I think the big culprit for that is the family court system. We know from epidemiological studies that children are best off if they have good half contact with both the mother and the father. There's evidence of that from public health, from epidemiological studies, but that's still not in practice. And we have child support guidelines that are mathematically flawed, that is actually driving parents away from their children. For example, we have situations where a father who spends no time with a child, if they spend more time with the child, they have to pay more child support. So it's actually benefiting the parent who is completely absent from the child life. That's what the government is doing with the child support guidelines. Or we have situations where if a father has two children with two different mothers, they have to pay more child support to the richer mother than to the poorer mother. They're basically taking money from the poor daughter to the rich daughter. Or we have situations where it just reverses it. So if you have two parents with half custody, the richer parent, the parent with more money, pays so much in child support that they end up with less money in the pocket than the other parent. So we have mathematical flaws in the child support guidelines that's harming children, putting children into poverty, and it's also discouraging people from actually getting married because they see this problem, and it's not a very publicly known problem, but it's known by everybody who's experienced it. They see their uncles or cousins or friends, and then they don't want to get married because they see how bad the system is. So I think that is a public health problem. We don't think of it always as a public health, but it is a public health problem that I think is very, very important to address.
That is fascinating. We should start thinking that the family breakdown has public health consequences that are severe and dramatic. We've always known that a child in a married household does far better on all sorts of measures, including health. I know I was asked by my general practitioner in the list of questions, do you exercise, et cetera, do you own a gun in the house? What was that? And that was from the Obama era when they were very anti-gun. But a better question would be, what's the family situation? Because that has real-world implications on public health. So in our waning few minutes, I'm going to just open up the floor. We've had a wonderful discussion. Any final thoughts and I'll go with each of you as to what should we be thinking about as a nation when it comes to public health? And take it in any direction you'd like. Dr. Redfield?
Well, I'm going to take a second to just reinforce what Bobby Kennedy has sort of put on the table, that it's time for us to make America healthy again. I think it's shocking to me when you go from the time when his uncle was president and we had a 1 to 3% obesity rate, and now we're looking at anywhere from a 40 to 70% obesity rate, depending on what group you look at. It's shocking when we had a chronic disease among the American public that might have been, say, less than 10%, and now we're looking at chronic disease is the rule, not the exception for most Americans living with chronic disease. And what if that chronic disease is obesity or hypertension or type 2 diabetes or mental illness or drug use disorder? These are serious or reactive airway disease. We're a sick country. And as the senator commented, what we've done, if we go back and try to dissect what we've done in my 50 years as a physician or 45 years as a physician, is we've progressively built a disease system. We've not built a health system. And I think what's exciting about Kennedy, because he's obviously very passionate about what he's about, and passion's important. You got to really believe. And the other thing that's important about Kennedy is he actually believes it's doable. I talk about his uncle when he said he was going to put a man on the moon, in 1962 before the end of the decade. We had no idea how to do that scientifically. But he obviously galvanized the country, and the thing that was more important, he actually believed it was going to get done. And in 1969, we put a man on the moon. Kennedy believes we can make America healthy again. I'm obviously committed to helping him accomplish that. As a physician, nothing could be more exciting than to flip this switch from a disease system, and the senators hit a number of it. That's what we have right now. We have a disease system. We pay for illness. Everything's there for as long as you're sick, the system works. We need to flip the switch and have it a health system so that we pay for wellness. And I think that, to me, is what's really exciting. And it's doable. I mean, I think the low-hanging fruit, as someone who sees the complexity with chronic human disease, and I'll defer to the next panel, I do think there's low-hanging fruit in correcting what we put in our body. When you really study what's happening with highly processed foods and how they end up contributing to obesity substantially, maybe getting rid of highly processed foods and some things could actually flip the switch pretty quickly in changing the percentage of the American public that are obese. Maybe use of some of the drug treatments that we have that can confront obesity to get people flipped back into the right direction. We can argue about it, but definitely obesity is a big problem. And so I think it's an exciting time for me, because I do think if we continue the momentum that Kennedy has, he gets his team in place, he'll get the American public behind him. Moms and dads, I have 14 grandchildren now. I want my grandchildren healthy. I want them healthy. And right now, if they follow the course of what's happening, they're on a course for not being healthy. So I think that, to me, is exciting. Make America healthy again. I think we've got to focus on it, both on the agricultural side, but all on the medical system side. The system's got to change from a disease system to a health system, and I couldn't agree with the senator more. Part of that is we got to put doctors back in top of making America healthy again.
Dr. Koldorf. Thoughts?
I think it is very important, like Dr. Redfield says, to have an open discussion about things. And if we have a crisis like a pandemic, that's when it's the most important to have the First Amendment and to have open discussions. We can never reach evidence-based medicine without an open discussion, so I think that is incredibly important. And then I think we have to look at public health is about all health in general. It's not just about like COVID. It's about the collateral damage from anything we do. So it's a combination of infectious diseases, of chronic diseases, of social environment that we're living in. It's all of those things that are very important for public health, and we have to tackle all of those things simultaneously, I think. And I'm very excited about this MAHA movement. I think that has an opportunity to change a lot. And for those people who are in favor of vaccines, and I'm one of them, the best thing we can do to increase vaccine confidence, which was destroyed by the COVID vaccines, which was completely mismanaged, the best thing we can do to increase vaccine confidence is to put somebody like RFK in charge and let him do all the vaccine safety studies that are needed. and we'll find out exactly what works and what doesn't work with vaccines. So to me, as a pro-vaccine person, I'm very excited to have RFK as the next Secretary of DHHS.
I appreciate the way Martin opened up the aperture and talked about the foundational building block of any successful society, the family, and how important that is to health. So I want to broaden up open the aperture even further. I'm generally not the most uplifting person, but here's why I've got a great deal of hope. I agree with Lincoln that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and I think probably the greatest threat facing our nation right now is the fact that we're a horribly divided nation. And what Bobby Kennedy did together with President Trump, coming together, setting their differences aside to focus on an area that the American public completely supports in a nonpartisan way. Let's figure out what's causing chronic illness. Let's stop destroying people who are just asking the question. So not only is it important as an example of how to fix a particular problem, find an area of agreement, focus on that, fix that problem, but even in a broader sense, it'll show you how to heal and unify a nation. And if we do this, and if we're successful, and we have to be successful, maybe once we've tackled that, we can start tackling these other enormous problems this nation faces in a completely non-partisan way. Quit going to your corners. Start finding the areas of agreement. Set your differences aside. And way above chronic illness, it might be the most important thing, the most important opportunity we have laying before us here. So I move into the next 4 years with a great deal of hope. Cross your fingers, pray. Let's take advantage of the situation.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. Next up will be Dr. Jay Richards.
President-elect Donald Trump and Vice President-elect J.D.